So this next set of videos is going to focus on respondent conditioning, which is commonly called classical conditioning. Basically our brain making an association between two stimuli and all the details of how that works. But first, before we can get into that, we have to understand the foundation on which respondent conditioning is built, which is reflexes. So from a biology perspective, we know creatures have a variety of innate behaviors, inherited behaviors, some more rigid than others. So you'll often hear the term fixed action pattern for a fixed behavioral sequence that's kind of released by the right stimulus and just runs to completion, even if the releasing stimulus disappears. For example, the mating dance in some birds, when they see the right stimulus, they start going through a set of mating display behaviors that are always the same beginning to end. Or another example would be some moth species that drop to the ground instantly if they hear ultrasonic noise that's similar to the sound bats make. The moths don't have to think about this. They don't choose to do it. It is automatically elicited by the stimulus showing up. They're born with this as an innate fixed action pattern. There are, of course, more flexible and nuanced versions of this that allow a little more variety and interactivity. For example, you might see a term like reaction chain. That's like a fixed action pattern, but it's a multi-step version where each step in the sequence only occurs if the proper stimulus shows up next. So like in some mating displays, if the male starts a mating display but the female isn't into it and doesn't reply with the right stimulus, then the whole complex mating dance stops rather than continuing the next steps of the display. But we're not going to worry too much about that stuff. What we're going to be most interested in for our purposes here is reflexes. So in a reflex, what happens is an unconditioned stimulus, a US, reliably elicits, kind of forces out a natural reaction called an unconditioned response, or UR. When I say unconditioned, I just mean unlearned, something you're born with. You can basically think of conditioning as a synonym for learning, so unconditioned means unlearned. Some examples of reflexes would be things like a puff of air at your eye, that's the unconditioned stimulus, automatically produces blinking. It elicits a blinking behavior, which is the unconditioned response. Remember, when we say response in this course, we always are just talking about some sort of behavior the creature does. So this isn't something you have to learn or something that only happens after you've gone to the eye doctor a few times and been exposed to it. You're just born with this reflex. Other reflexes might be things like seeing nudity of the body type you're attracted to, that would be the US, produces arousal, which is the unconditioned response. Or tasting sour produces a cringe face as a response, right? A behavior that comes afterward. Or a loud noise stimulus might produce a startle or jump sort of response. Or if you're a bee, sugar touching your antenna is a stimulus that might automatically make you extend your proboscis in response. So these are examples of reflexes. Notice that it's always a US eliciting a UR. So when we test creatures ranging from humans to cats to snails to bees, we find that reflexes always follow three basic laws, the laws of the reflex. So the first of these we'll call the law of threshold, which states that there's a threshold below which the unconditioned stimulus doesn't always produce an unconditioned response. Basically, a puff of air hitting your eye will make you blink, but if the puff is so weak that you can't even feel it, then you won't always blink. Or a sudden loud noise will cause a startle response, but a much quieter noise won't meet the threshold and won't necessarily cause a startle response. Okay? The second law of the reflex is the law of intensity, which states that a greater unconditioned stimulus produces a greater unconditioned response. So less unconditioned stimulus then produces less of an unconditioned response. In other words, loud noises produce a startle, but even louder noises produce even more of a startle. A bit of sour taste makes you do a little bit of a cringe face, but something super sour makes you do the cringe face big time. Okay? That's the law of intensity. Finally, there's the law of latency, which states that a more intense unconditioned stimulus makes the unconditioned response happen faster. So there's less latency for an extreme stimulus. A very loud noise will make the startle response happen quicker than a somewhat loud noise. So the reflexes, that they all follow these three laws: law of the threshold, law of intensity, and the law of latency. In a moment, I'm going to show you a video of a rat just demonstrating a simple reflex. The unconditioned stimulus here is going to be a loud noise, and the unconditioned response, the innate response the rat has as a reflex, is going to be a startle kind of jump response that you'll see the rat make when the noise happens. Now they're going to cut some time out of the video, so keep in mind there might actually be a short or even a long delay between each time the loud noise happens, while this rat is otherwise just chilling and exploring in his little box. Now what I want you to pay attention to as you watch his reflexive response here is how the reflex response changes from the beginning of this clip to the end. So you can see him startling. He stops his exploring after the loud noise. But watch as over time the noise keeps happening. Eventually he stops having that much response and just keeps exploring the box as if nothing's happening. So what's going on here? What we just saw happen was a process called habituation, which can happen to reflexes. Habituation is the decrease of an unconditioned response to a repeating unconditioned stimulus. Basically, if you keep setting off a reflex, you'll have less of a response, less of the behavior happens. So what we're seeing is a reduction of naturally elicited behavior, a temporary weakening of the reflex if it gets activated over and over and over again. This is basically the simplest form of learning, something even more basic than respondent conditioning or operant conditioning, something there's even some evidence that plants can show this form of learning, of habituation. Now, one important thing to note here is this is different from what's called sensory adaptation. That would be where repeated stimuli make it harder for your neural sensors to detect a stimulus. Like if you stare at a green circle long enough, those green detecting cones in your eye stop being able to detect green briefly. That's sensory adaptation, but that's not what's happening here. This is also different from a more general fatigue, which is basically when you kind of generally get too tired to respond to anything. So fatigue isn't specific to what stimulus or response is involved. It makes all your behaviors weaker, whereas habituation is specific to only the reflex that keeps getting activated. With habituation, the unconditioned stimulus is still detected, and only the unconditioned response is diminished, not all behaviors. So it's different from these other things. Now, habituation is generally temporary. The unconditioned response will recover if the unconditioned stimulus is withheld for a while. Basically, if you don't turn on the reflex for a while, the habituation kind of goes away. You can get long-term habituation, like if you live next to an airport or train tracks and get used to the sound after living there a few months. But in the same way, if the US doesn't show up for a while, like if the airport or the train was shut down for 6 months, then the reflex recovers and you'll start responding to that sound when it starts back up again. Also, for habituation, the biggest drop in the unconditioned response occurs early in the process, after those first few times the reflex is activated. Then you get a slower adjustment to subsequent unconditioned stimulus repeats. In other words, eventually you're only getting a little bit more habituated each time, whereas at first you were getting a lot of habituation during those initial exposures. For example, the data you see here in the graph in the middle, this is for a snail's withdrawal reflex. If you tap the shell of a snail, and they have a reflexive response of withdrawing into the shell. And we've graphed out here on the bottom x-axis, this is how many times you've tapped to activate that reflex. And on the left, on the y-axis here, what we've got is how big of a response there is. In this case, how long the snail hides away as a reaction to that tap. And you can see that in the first few taps, on the left of that purple line, you get a big response, a long time hiding in the shell. But if you keep tapping, you keep activating that reflex, it starts having less and less of a reaction to it. That's habituation. And it's not linear, right? The curve drops fastest in those first few exposures. We get the most habituation in those early trials, and then it drops slower. It starts habituating slower in those later trials. Now, some applied examples of habituation would be things like, we've got research showing that people eat more food when the meal has variety to it, and less food when it's the exact same taste in each bite. We habituate quickly to the same flavor stimulus and have less of a response to it. So you can think of it like that first bite of ice cream could be really orgasmic, but if you eat a half gallon of the exact same ice cream in one sitting, probably those last few bites aren't nearly as enjoyable. You don't get as much of a hedonic response, right? There's much less of a response to the same stimulus. That's habituation. Or another applied example from the biology literature comes from prairie dogs. They make alarm calls whenever a large creature approaches. That's an innate reflexive response for prairie dogs. But after repeated exposure to human footsteps without taking any harm, they actually stop making alarm calls to humans. That's habituating. Now, as important and as common as habituation is, there's another phenomenon, sort of its natural opposite, which can also happen, and that's sensitization. That's the increase of an unconditioned response to a repeating US. In other words, where habituation was the decrease of a naturally elicited behavior, here we get an increase of a naturally elicited behavior, more of the reflex happening after activating it a few times. So when does this happen instead of habituation? One classic example of this is that a shock presented over and over again can actually make the subject become hyper-aware, kind of hyper-vigilant, cause it to react more to the shock each time it comes. So if that's the pattern we observe, we would say sensitization has occurred rather than saying habituation has occurred. So for example, experiencing something traumatic over and over again doesn't mean you'll habituate to that stimulus. So some reflexes will get more sensitive rather than less from the repeated exposure. Now, when sensitization happens, there's another really big difference from habituation, and that's that sensitization is not specific to the stimulus. So think of it this way, a painful stimulus like a shock might make the subject also become more responsive to a different stimulus like just loud noises in general. So you might think of sensitization as a general increase in vigilance or hyper-awareness. Also, sensitization is faster for more intense stimuli. So think of it like strong shocks will sensitize a horse faster than weak shocks. Whereas habituation works the opposite. Habituation is faster for weaker stimuli. So in that case, like a baby will get used to a somewhat loud noise that keeps happening much faster than the baby would get used to a very loud noise that keeps happening. That would be slower for habituation. Now, finally, there's one last process relevant to habituation, and that's something that researchers studying it quickly noticed. If you introduce a new, novel stimulus after or during habituation, it can briefly re-increase or reset that unconditioned response behavior. In other words, it can temporarily get rid of the habituation just by having something novel show up. Basically, when the habituation process is happening, if some big new thing occurs in your environment, some sort of surprise that temporarily interrupts the habituation and can make the reflex become active again. Maybe because that's a sign that the situation might have changed, and thus our habituation might not be as relevant anymore. But the habituation process, in other words, it seems to have evolved to be somewhat situation specific. And changing the situation, adding some novelty, adding some uncertainty, that brings the reflex sort of back online again. So an example of dishabituation might be if you've habituated to a quiet background sound, like the ticking of a clock in the bedroom as you're trying to fall asleep, but then you hear a new noise like a car honking outside. That will briefly make the quiet ticking of the clock salient and noticeable again, so it dishabituates you. Now, I realize it can be confusing that there are two things that are kind of counter to habituation. So think of it this way. Sensitization is the opposite of habituation as a process, where sensitization is all about a repeated stimulus that happens to increase that reflexive response rather than decreasing it. So it's just like habituation, where it's all about activating the reflex over and over again. This just happens to be where it increases the response rather than making it go down over time. Whereas this other process we just talked about, dishabituation, it's more just about a single new stimulus showing up one time, and that quickly but temporarily counters habituation. So you can experience habituation and dishabituation at home if you have a couple common ingredients ingredients. Like if you've got a bit of lemon juice and lime juice, pick those up at the store if you don't have any, or even just slice a couple of lemons and maybe one lime into some little bites. You can do this for yourself and it should work, or for fun, for even more fun, you can do it with a friend and have the participant, whoever, you could take turns, but whoever's the participant, be blindfolded or keep their eyes closed while you hand them a piece to bite into. So to experience habituation, you'd simply bite into a lemon slice, see how much of a response there is, how much of like sour cringe face that someone makes, then maybe repeat that 20 seconds later with a new slice of lemon. And again, 20 seconds later with a new lemon taste. And again, and again. Do that quite a few times. Pretty soon you'll notice much less cringe face to the sourness of the lemon. That would be habituation. Less of an unconditioned response to that lemon tasting sour stimulus. But here's where you can throw a wrench into things. Let's dishabituate. So after you've done that, while the participant is doing this, bite into a lemon slice, bite into a lemon slice, bite into a lemon slice every 20 seconds, and they're getting habituated to it, you want to suddenly and sneakily insert a lime slice into the process. Like hand them a lime slice when they expected that it was a lemon, and they're blindfolded so they don't see it coming. The lime taste will obviously be a surprise, right? It's a novel stimulus, a new taste compared to what's been going on in this situation. And what happens? They will experience oh, lime taste is new. They'll be surprised, they'll laugh, whatever it is. But here's the funny thing. Now you go back to lemon slices again, and you'll notice that the very next lemon slice will cause a much bigger response than you were getting just a couple bites ago prior to the lime. The habituation has either reset or at least weakened somewhat, though this is temporary, and if you keep doing the lemon slices now, they will go back to that minimal response. The habituation kicks back in. So let's see an example in a video clip. So here you're going to see a rat, again, in a little testing chamber that's been habituated to the sound, just like in the previous video. The sound has become just some boring background stimulus that doesn't cause much of a startle response at all. But partway through, someone's going to slam a door in the rat's testing room. Just one time, a single new noise. Notice what happens afterward when that same old boring background sound shows up again. So notice he doesn't care. He's habituated to the sound. But then a door slam happens. And now he's startled by that noise he didn't care about a minute ago. So that's dishabituation. The original habituation has gone away. All right. Here is a more kind of fun and funny example from a boyfriend pranking his girlfriend.
So hello, today I'll be showing you the effect of dishabituation using this.
Fico, man!
Psychology.
So here, she habituated to the spider stimulus, having less of a reflexive response after that repeated exposure. But then a novel stimulus undid some of that. She dishabituated. And immediately afterward, the original little spider started to cause a bigger response than it had been after the habituating. Note, by the way, that he didn't have to use a giant version of the spider as the novel stimulus to dishabituate her. It could have been anything kind of new or surprising in the environment, like even their doorbell ringing suddenly or him releasing a big sneeze out of the blue. This kind of phenomenon is actually applied a lot by developmental psychologists who want to study pre-verbal infants. So let me show you an example. Here's a little baby. Babies get used to things that they see or hear over and over again. They habituate. So if you keep shaking the same toy in front of an infant she'll stop paying much attention to it, right? She won't pay as much attention. She won't look as long. So as she habituates, she spends less time looking at it, doesn't look toward its noise or movement as much, or moves, looks toward it more slowly. That's habituation. But at the end here, they're going to introduce a novel stimulus. At the end, they're going to introduce a new toy with a different shape and color and sound that dishabituates the baby. After which, if we go back to that original toy, it'll cause more of a response again. Even though the baby had stopped responding, it had habituated, what you might say sort of the baby was bored of it, it'll be less bored, it'll be less habituated because of that other novel thing that showed up in the environment. So an example study that used this kind of technique to look at spatial cognition in infants was by Kaufman and Needham back around 2000. What they were looking at was to kind of understand space and spatial relationships to objects, like to figure out how infants process these things, how that's represented in the infant brain. So to do this study, they habituated an infant to an object on a table, so the baby wasn't responding much to that object. It had habituated, it was bored of the object. Then they compared two conditions. They either moved the object to a new location, or they moved the infant to a new location. So in both cases, they then looked for dishabituation to see if the infant started attending to that previously habituated object again. And if they found a difference in dishabituation between those two conditions, that would tell us about how infants represent space, whether it's egocentrically or allocentrically, sort of self-centered or object-centered or what. But only by knowing about habituation and dishabituation could developmental psychologists study something like this. So that's one application in another area of psychology of concepts like this. Anyway, well, in this video here, all the rest of the videos in this set are going to be about a process that builds off of our innate reflexes, something that gives us flexibility to adapt to whatever environment we're exposed to, rather than needing an innate genetically programmed reflex for every single situation and every single stimulus we might encounter. So this process means we can add new response patterns based on the environment we happen to experience during our life. This process we'll be talking about is respondent conditioning. And the next video is going to cover just the basics before the later videos in this series dive into some more detail and complexity.